I remember winter, because the silence felt intentional. I lived alone in a narrow house at the edge of a forgotten development, where the land beyond the yard dissolved into trees that never seemed to move. Solitude had always comforted me, and the quiet there felt curated. Like the house understood restraint, age softened the walls, but the rooms whispered warmth and familiarity, the kind that convinces you to trust it. The cold that weekend pressed against everything. Snow existed somewhere outside, constant and patient, and the temperature lived well below mercy. Time felt suspended, hours blending together until night arrived without ceremony. My thoughts lingered on how peaceful it all seemed, how nothing ever happened there, how safety could feel earned through routine alone. There was one flaw I dismissed. The lock on my bedroom door had not worked for months. I told myself, it doesn't matter, Alaric. I told myself solitude was protection enough. A lock implied threat, and I did not believe in one. The idea of replacing it felt absurd, almost paranoid. I trusted the rest of the house to decide who belonged. That trust sat strangely in my mind. I remember thinking about thresholds, about what doors symbolized when they could no longer choose. I asked myself whether privacy required permission or belief. The house offered no answers, only a depth of silence that felt observant, somewhere between thought and unease. Another idea formed, uninvited. If something noticed the broken lock before I did, would it interpret that as carelessness or invitation? I remember whispering, "No one is here but me," and immediately wondering why I felt the need to say it aloud at all. The silence did not disagree, and that realization settled deeper than fear, deeper than logic, deeper than sleep itself tonight alone.
That night began like any other, though I knew immediately that something in the air was off, heavier, colder, like a pulse of expectation pressing down on my chest. My apartment, usually my sanctuary, felt suddenly wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed sharper, almost layered, as though they were aware of me and shifting just out of the corner of my vision. I could feel it in the very marrow of my bones. Someone or something was there. I kept my breathing shallow, heart pounding against my ribcage like a frantic drum. The lock on my bedroom door, a feeble barrier of cheap metal, had been broken for months, a detail I'd never thought significant until that night. Now, with the shadows twisting against the walls, it felt like an invitation. My mind ran through possibilities, each one darker than the last. Perhaps it was the house settling, or maybe the wind whispering through the thin window panes, but rational thoughts only heightened my unease. Something insisted it wasn't the wind, that it wasn't just the house. I remembered the stories my grandmother had whispered in hushed tones about unseen presences, always warning me to trust the instinct that prickled at the nape of the neck. Tonight, that instinct screamed. I tried to steady myself, telling my mind to focus on the mundane, counting the tiles on the floor, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, any sound that would root me in reality. But even those small markers of normalcy felt alien, as though the world itself had warped, leaving only me and the pressure of a silent, watching presence. Minutes crawled. I lay there, half awake, half trapped in a waking nightmare, watching the darkness beyond the door. It was cracked open, a black slit that shouldn't have been, and my mind refused the simple explanations I offered. Something had moved. I'd felt it, a shift behind the door frame, an almost imperceptible scrape across the floor. My pulse thundered louder than my rational thoughts. I considered calling out, telling whatever was there that I was awake, but my voice felt like lead in my throat. The hours stretched then, time bending round me, until I finally allowed myself to drift. I woke again, the same sudden jolt, as if a current had shot through my nervous system. The door was still open. The darkness beyond it seemed to breathe. I remembered locking the main entrance earlier, but that certainty brought no comfort if anyone was inside. They were inside, and they could be anywhere. My eyes traced the familiar contours of the room, now foreign, every object a potential witness. Then I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the corner, small at first, shifting into a shape I recognized only as human. My stomach twisted. I didn't move. The mind screamed to flee, but my body was glued to the bed. It lingered at the threshold of my consciousness, like the memory of a nightmare you can't shake. And as I forced myself to breathe, to keep rationality tethered to the fear, I realized the bed itself seemed smaller, the walls closer. The house had become a labyrinth designed to isolate me, to focus my attention, to make me aware that whatever waited beyond the door knew exactly where I would be. I forced myself to sit up, to look directly at the door, but the shadow didn't retreat. Instead, it shifted imperceptibly, like it had been watching me watch it, gauging my reactions. My mind raced through options: call the police, grab anything to defend myself, escape through the window, but each possibility felt impotent. The fear wasn't just physical, it was existential. I couldn't merely survive this night, I had to anticipate it, predict it, understand it. But the rules had changed. Someone or something had invaded my home and rewritten them entirely. The minutes dragged into eternity, punctuated only by the faintest, most deliberate sounds: the whisper of air through the vents, the subtle scrape of a floorboard, the imperceptible creak of a hinge. Then, suddenly, silence, a weighty, absolute silence that pressed against my eardrums and made my heart drum even faster. And from that silence came the certainty that I was not alone, that this night was not a random intrusion, but a prelude. I could feel it waiting, patient, unseen, as if time itself had become a conduit for its presence. When I finally forced my limbs into motion, the apartment felt alien, as though each step echoed louder than reality should allow. I moved without looking, relying on muscle memory, tracing familiar paths that no longer offered comfort. The darkness was no longer passive. It felt alive, curling along the walls, pulling in the corners. Something had left a trail, small, almost imperceptible, the shadow of movement imprinted on the floorboards. I followed it instinctively, my mind screaming that I shouldn't, that every fiber of my being should stop. But curiosity mingled with terror, a poison I couldn't resist. It led me to the kitchen. The hallway light remained off, yet the space seemed brighter somehow, lit by an unseen glow. My eyes adjusted, catching the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the threshold, a man whose presence felt impossibly still and yet full of purpose. The silence pressed round me. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator was drowned by the thudding of my own heart. I wanted to speak, to ask what he wanted, but words stuck like ice in my throat. I only stared, willing him to vanish, knowing he wouldn't. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, measured. They didn't echo in the way I expected. Instead, they absorbed the sound. Each step a quiet defiance against the rules of my home. My mind constructed scenarios, each more horrifying than the last. He wasn't just intruding. He was studying me, predicting my movements, learning how my fear sounded, smelled, how it moved through my body. I realized with a sick twist of understanding that he had been here before, quietly, patiently, carving out my routines like a sculptor preparing clay. I tried to regain rationality, to remind myself of the laws, the boundaries, the idea that nothing living could simply disappear into shadows. But rationality faltered in the presence of his silence. He didn't speak, didn't reveal himself fully. He existed in the periphery, a predator framing the scene, an artist painting dread with invisible brushstrokes. My apartment, my sanctuary, had been compromised. Every familiar object, the worn couch, the frayed carpet, the faint stain on the towel became a potential instrument in his plan. The discovery that chilled me most wasn't his silhouette at the window, nor the slow, deliberate descent of his steps through the hallway. It was the realization that the apartment itself had been watching with him. Doors that I thought locked held only the illusion of safety. Windows that appeared opaque allowed glimpses of a world I couldn't touch. I understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that my home had become a stage, my fear the central performance, and I was the unwilling actor. Time fractured. Minutes were hours. Ours became a distorted continuum. I listened as the soft shuffling moved from room to room, aware of his presence without ever seeing him directly. My mind began cataloging every creak, every shadow, every moment where I might have imagined something that was, in fact, real. And I couldn't stop. There was no courage, only awareness, and the knowledge that my awareness made me prey. When he finally departed, or at least when I convinced myself he had, the apartment did not return to normal. The air remained heavy, perfumed with the invisible residue of intrusion. Footsteps might have left, but something else lingered, the certainty that the spaces I knew so intimately had been mapped, measured, and exploited. Every corner of the apartment became suspect. Every shadow, a potential harbinger. Every sound, an omen. I left that night for a friend's house, but even in the warm safety of another home, my mind traced the paths of the intruder, reconstructed the hours of dread, and realized with cold finality that the invasion wasn't merely of space, it was of my psyche. The apartment would never be mine again. Sleep would never be mine again. And every quiet night, every shadowed corner, every unlatched door would carry the echo of that presence. I could not unsee what I had seen, could not unfeel what I had felt. And in that lingering terror I understood the true nature of home invasion. It is not just the violation of a space, but the theft of. Certainty, leaving only the raw and ending awareness that someone, something has known exactly where. You sleep. I didn't understand the true weight of that night until much later, when silence stopped feeling empty and started feeling observant. Even after leaving the house, I carried the sense that something had taught me, memorized my habits, and adjusted accordingly. The fear wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet and patient. Woven into ordinary moments, doors closing behind me felt deliberate. Windows reflected more than they should have. Sleep became shallow, filled with half-awake calculations about distance, visibility, and escape. What unsettled me most was how ordinary the warning signs had seemed at first. How easy it was to excuse them as flaws, coincidences, or imagination. Looking back, the danger wasn't the intrusion itself, but the realization that vulnerability can be studied over time. Some places don't turn hostile all at once. They wait. And when you finally understand what's been watching you, the only choice left is deciding how far you're willing to go to feel safe again. That knowledge lingers longer than fear, reshaping how every room, every lock, and every quiet moment is perceived afterward and forever. Later, I discovered the back of the house had offered more access than I realized. Locks failing quietly, patterns repeating too precisely to ignore. That meant the intrusion likely wasn't new. It was practiced. I didn't wait for certainty after that. I left, put distance between myself and that place, and I still hope the attention stayed behind. I'm writing this while winter presses against the calendar, but the memory belongs to Halloween, when quiet meant something else. I hesitated before confessing it, because confession invites attention, and attention is never harmless. Still, if this reaches someone, maybe it will name the danger sooner. My name is Moving, and I lived in an old apartment complex at the edge of town, the kind of place built to be forgotten. It wasn't violent or infamous, just tired, inexpensive, and resigned to neglect. Renovations had tried to hide the age, but rot has a patience paint cannot defeat. Units emptied one by one, leaving absences that felt intentional. I wondered if the building preferred fewer witnesses. Owners remained unnamed, like ghosts who collected rent without presence. Eventually, I suspected I was alone there, the last resident tolerated rather than welcomed. Silence became architectural, packed into corridors and stairwells like insulation. Sometimes I spoke aloud to test the space. Is anyone here? I'd ask, and the question felt impolite, almost accusatory. The answer was always the same: nothing, delivered with confidence. That kind of nothing listens. I told myself solitude was safety. That emptiness couldn't mean observation. My thoughts argued back, reminding me how often neglect creates opportunity. A month before everything changed, the stillness felt rehearsed. It suggested rehearsal. I remember thinking the building knew my routines better than I did. You're imagining patterns, I told myself. The reassurance sounded borrowed. Halloween came, and the silence felt expectant, as if it had been waiting for acknowledgement. In that place, being alone was not the same as being unaccompanied, and the difference mattered more than I understood then. I write this now because places remember names, and Morvain is still whispered there, patient, listening, confident, unchanged, long after people leave forever. By the time I finally decided to write this down, Halloween had already passed, and winter had settled in hot enough that the windows stayed fogged even during the day. I kept thinking that if I waited long enough, the details would dull on their own, that whatever sense of threat I felt would fade into something manageable. It didn't. If anything, the silence afterward made everything louder in my head. I was living alone in an apartment building that most people didn't even realize was still occupied. It sat on the edge of town, far enough away that street lights thinned out and the road leading to it felt forgotten. The building itself was old, built sometime in the early 1900s, and it showed in ways that renovation never fully erased. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old wood, and the walls carried sound in strange ways, sometimes amplifying it, sometimes swallowing it entirely. Most of the other tenants had moved out over the past few years, one by one. Units went dark and never lit up again. Furniture was left behind. Mail piled up behind doors that were never opened. Eventually, I realized I wasn't seeing anyone at all. No footsteps, no voices, no doors opening or closing. Just me and the echo of my own movements. On Halloween night, I worked late. By the time I got home, it didn't feel like holiday. There were no decorations, no noise from nearby houses, no children outside. I dropped my bag near the couch and sat down, thinking I might put on something festive just to mark the day. A horror movie felt appropriate, though even that felt unnecessary in a place that already made me uneasy. It was around 9 o'clock when the knock came. It wasn't timid or uncertain. 3 firm knocks, close together, loud enough that my heart jumped before my mind caught up. The sound didn't echo the way other noises did. It felt intentional, like someone standing directly on the other side of my door, waiting. I froze longer than I cared to admit. No one ever knocked. No one ever came by. The building wasn't on any trick-or-treat routes, and even if it had been, there was no way a child would wander inside alone. When I finally opened the door a few inches, confusion overtook fear. A child stood there, small and motionless, wearing a Halloween costume and holding out a bag. The bag was empty. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just looked up at me through the mask, head slightly tilted, as if waiting for something specific. I remember asking questions that felt stupid the moment they left my mouth. Where were her parents? How did she get inside? Did she live here? She didn't answer any of them. There was no fear in her posture, no impatience, no emotion at all. It was like she was performing a role without understanding it. I leaned into the hallway and saw nothing. No adults, no other kids, just a long, dim corridor stretching toward the staircase. When I looked back at her, she had already turned away. I listened as her footsteps faded down the stairs. That was when the feeling started, the sense that something had been set in motion. I locked the door and stood there, staring at it, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But the questions wouldn't stop. How did she get in? Why my door? Why now? I checked the windows overlooking the parking lot. My car was the only one there. After a few minutes, curiosity outweighed caution. I put on my jacket and stepped into the hallway. The building felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was waiting. I made my way downstairs, checked the entrance, and saw nothing outside. But as I turned back in, something caught my eye. The keypad beside the front door was lit. It had never worked before, not once. I tested the lock. It clicked shut like it always had. Still, the light blinked softly, steady and deliberate, as if acknowledging me. I started back upstairs and settled, but telling myself there had to be an explanation. Halfway up, I noticed a door on the second floor standing open. It hadn't been before. I called out, my voice echoing into emptiness. There was no reply. By the time I reached my unit and closed the door behind me, my hands were shaking. I hadn't even crossed the living room when the knock came again, louder this time, closer, more urgent. And this time, I knew it wasn't a child. As I hesitated outside my apartment door, the building seemed to shrink round me, its shadows stretching and twisting like dark fingers over the cracked linoleum. The memory of the girl at my door noted me how her mask had hidden a blank, unreadable face, and yet somehow her presence had commanded my attention. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that something far older than the empty hallways themselves had crept inside, threading itself into my perception. I leaned against the wall, straining to hear a hint of movement, a whisper, a shuffle, but there was nothing except the faint hum of a distant heater and my own uneven breathing. The silence pressed against me, dense and suffocating, and I realized with sudden clarity that I was utterly alone, yet profoundly observed. I edged down the hall again, every step echoing like a gunshot in the emptiness. As I passed the unit doors, I tried to convince myself that the one that had been open moments before was a trick of my eyes. But the sight of the dark, yawning threshold stopped me cold. A whisper rose in my mind. Someone or something had been inside while I wasn't looking. The possibility churned uneasily. A thick, bitter taste in the back of my throat. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, every corner a trap for the imagination, every shadow a potential threat. Then, From somewhere deeper in the building, I heard it, a faint, deliberate knock. 3 sharp raps that resonated like a warning. My throat tightened. I wasn't imagining it. My heart surged, the logical part of me screaming that the building should be empty, that no one should have access, but the irrational part knew better. My mind replayed every horror story I'd ever consumed, each one echoing in my skull as the sound repeated, synchronized with the racing of my pulse. I backed up, chest tight, scanning for a place to hide. My apartment offered no sanctuary. My eyes settled on the balcony and its blinds, the only barrier between me and the unknown. I moved slowly, feeling invisible eyes pressing against my spine, counting each heartbeat like a countdown. Outside, the cold Halloween air seeped through the thin doorframe, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and decay. It was almost comforting, but the sensation dissolved as a deeper dread seeped in. A thump inside the building startled me, a sound so deliberate it might as well have been a heartbeat. The blinds shifted slightly as a sliver of light seeped in from the hall. And then I saw them. 2 figures moved deliberately, scanning the rooms as though they knew every inch of the building. The girl had been bait. They had waited until I was vulnerable, conditioned by that silence and emptiness, to make me open my door willingly. I froze, stomach knotting, as the first figure leaned near the balcony, fingers brushing the glass, the other whispering something just beyond comprehension. Time lost meaning. They were there for what felt like hours, moving through the shadows, their presence saturating the air with an oppressive dread. My mind screamed at me to escape, but where could I go? The tiny apartment felt like a cage, walls closing in. And then, as abruptly as they had appeared, they left. My ears strained for the retreating steps, the faint scrape of shoes on tile, the whispered communications fading into the cold stillness. I waited 10 minutes, shivering, until the distant siren signaled help. When the police arrived, they found nothing, no signs of entry beyond my own unlocked door, no footprints, no evidence that anyone else had been inside. And yet I knew the truth. The girl, the figures, the manipulation, it had all been orchestrated. I was the only one living there, legally, the only target. The building itself seemed to exhale behind me, the walls heavy with unseen awareness. Even now, recounting the events, I cannot shake the feeling that they had never truly left. That night, the empty corridors of my apartment became a mirror of my own vulnerability, reflecting a calculated threat I had walked straight into. The shadows themselves seemed to twitch, as if amused by my terror. And I know, without doubt, that the building had been waiting for someone exactly like me, someone alone, someone naive, until it could demonstrate the precise horror that comes from realizing the unseen can always reach inside. And that silence is never just silence. The night had always felt heavier here, the kind of darkness that pressed against walls and whispered through cracks in the floorboards. I had convinced myself I was alone, that the empty corridors of the old building were just a quirk of its age. But that night, something shifted. Shadows pooled differently, lingering longer than they should, and the faint hum of the heater sounded like a low, distant moan. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling, the wind outside, but the silence round me was too absolute, too deliberate. Every instinct I had screamed at me that I wasn't alone, that I never had been. I could feel eyes tracing my movements, invisible yet unrelenting, waiting for the perfect moment. Even the faintest sounds, my own breathing, the scraping of my chair, seemed amplified, echoing like warnings I didn't want to heed. Something was orchestrating the night, something patient, something watching. I had no way of knowing if it had been there for years, or if it had just arrived, slipping silently between the gaps of reality and fear. I left that night, and for a while, the darkness seemed to fade, retreating as if satisfied I had fled. The building remained, silent and vacant, but the memory of that night never left me. I don't know what was truly waiting in those shadowed halls, or why it had chosen me, but I am grateful I never had to find out firsthand. Some doors, some nights, are best left unopened. I used to work alone nights at a decrepit shipping warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place reeked of rust and dust, its walls scarred with years of neglect. Only the dim flicker of a single fluorescent bulb marked the passage of time. At first, solitude was comforting. I told myself it was peaceful, a quiet reprieve from the world outside. But soon, I noticed the silence wasn't neutral, it was watching me. I would keep my headphones in, pretending the world existed somewhere beyond the shelves and metal racks. Machines that roared all day were dead at night, leaving only the hollow echo of my own breathing. Every footstep, I imagined, made my pulse spike, though no one else was supposed to be there. Even the crickets beyond the warehouse windows seemed to deliberate, their chirps forming patterns I couldn't decode. Sometimes I would catch myself imagining whispers just beyond my peripheral vision. The shadows cast by shelving stretched unnaturally long, leaning toward me like intent shapes. I would tell myself it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion, but a small dread nested in my chest whenever the overhead lights buzzed or sputtered. That night, the quiet became oppressive. Each tick of the clock, every scratch against metal, felt like a signal. I realized the warehouse was no longer a backdrop, I was part of it, small and exposed. And then a faint creak echoed from the far corner, a sound that wasn't mine, a presence that had slipped through the cracks of normality. I froze, questioning if it was even possible to hear fear before it arrived. Every instinct screamed that something unseen was moving, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The warehouse was awake now, patient and somehow hungry. I always thought abandoned buildings carried their own rhythm, a heartbeat you could feel if you listened closely enough. This Halloween night, the kind of night where the wind doesn't just whistle but seems to watch, I found myself walking the cracked hallways of the old apartment complex at the edge of town. Nobody had lived here for months, maybe years, aside from me. That's what made it comforting, at first quiet, and touched, private. But comfort has a way of twisting when shadows feel thicker than usual. I remember standing in the hallway, the dim bulbs overhead flickering in uneven intervals. I thought I saw movement at the far end of the hall, something tiny, almost a shadow smaller than it should have been. My first thought was a child, no, not just any child. One in a costume, standing motionless, holding something up like an offering, a bag that seemed to still, to empty, as if it weren't for collecting but for looking. I told myself it had to be imagination, the stress of isolation bending reality. Yet every instinct in me screamed that something was deliberately here, waiting, knowing exactly what it was doing. The silence of the building pressed against my eardrums, amplified by the stillness of rooms that had once housed families, now only whispers. I kept thinking, maybe the owners had left something behind. A forgotten doll, a misplaced toy, but the figure at the end of the hall didn't belong. Its presence had a weight, subtle but undeniable, like a pulse beneath the floorboards. My chest tightened, and I imagined the possibility that I wasn't alone. The thought made the hallway narrower, the walls closer, and the shadows deeper than they should have been. I called out softly, almost unwilling to hear a response. "Hello? Are you okay?" My voice echoed, swallowed by the cold air. There was no answer, only the faint creak of the hall, that subtle shuffle I couldn't place, like tiny shoes padding just beyond my vision. The child or whatever it was didn't move from the far end. Its stillness was deliberate, unnerving. Every instinct told me not to step closer, yet curiosity clawed at my mind, dragging me forward despite the dread. I tried reasoning with myself. Maybe someone else had broken in, someone looking for shelter, someone harmless. But the atmosphere so wrong, so tense said otherwise. The walls seemed to hum with an invisible presence, and I imagined eyes on me from darkened doorways, watching, testing, waiting for the moment I slipped. I tried to focus on the child again, its small figure motionless, bag raised as if it were signaling something I wasn't supposed to understand. I leaned slightly forward, whispering, "Do you need anything?" and imagined the child nodding, slowly, deliberately. A chill ran down my spine, not from cold, but from the certainty that the hallway wasn't empty, that I was being conditioned, like a moth drawn to a candle's flame. Each step forward felt heavier, the darkness stretching, shaping itself around me. The sound of faint breathing, or maybe it was mine, amplified by fear, filled the hall, mingling with a soft rustle behind the figure. I froze, heart hammering, and realized the bag wasn't just empty. It was a lure, an invitation, a signal for something larger, something hidden beyond the edges of perception. The subtle terror seeped in, a pressure in my skull, whispering that the apartment building itself was aware, that it had been waiting for me to notice, to take the bait. I knew then that tonight was different. The isolation, the silence, the child at the end of the hall, all signs converging into an awareness I couldn't shake. I could feel it watching me, studying me, waiting for me to act. And as I stood there, unsure whether to approach or retreat, a faint shuffle echoed again, smaller, deliberate, as if confirming that I wasn't imagining it. The building breathed round me, exhaling tension and anticipation, and I understood that this Halloween would mark the night I learned the old walls weren't empty. Not really. After that first encounter in the hallway, I couldn't bring myself to go back to my apartment right away. The building, once a familiar quiet, now seemed alive with intent, the shadows stretching longer than they should, twisting just beyond vision. Every creak in the floor, every whisper of wind through broken windows, felt deliberate, as though the walls themselves were observing me, cataloging my hesitation. I told myself it was just the isolation, my imagination warping the abandoned hallways, but the lingering presence of that child motionless, unreadable, had planted a seed that wouldn't be ignored. I waited in the stairwell, breathing shallow, straining to hear any faint sound from above. For a long moment, there was nothing but the steady hum of distant city traffic, muffled and indifferent. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate padding from the floor above. Not running, not hurried, but precise, deliberate, like someone testing how far they could push before I reacted. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't the child's feet alone. There was something else accompanying it, something heavier, darker, sliding just beyond the edge of the hall's dim light. I tried to reason. Maybe it was the building settling. Maybe it was an animal. But the cadence of the steps, paired with the memory of the child, made my mind refuse that explanation. The quiet inevitability pressed down on me, and I could almost see the lines of calculation behind the child's gaze, the deliberate positioning, the small figure standing as bait for whatever waited in the shadows. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet curiosity terrible. Human curiosity tugged me forward, closer to the corridor where the figure had stood. As I crept toward the apartment I called home, the silence shifted subtly. It wasn't just quiet, It was anticipatory, expectant. I could almost hear it think, measuring my steps, my breaths, my hesitation. The child was no longer visible, but I sensed its presence in the corners, the subtle movement of air, the way the shadows flickered when I passed a doorway. The apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like the center of a trap, and the deeper I went, the heavier the atmosphere became, thick with unspoken intent. I paused outside my door, the dim hallway light casting jagged shadows on the walls. I pressed my ear to it, straining to hear any sign of life, but all I got was the faintest echo of small footsteps retreating, deliberately leaving the space empty. My mind conjured the figure of the child again, imagining a tiny hand waving, beckoning me toward the edge of understanding or danger. The building had shifted in my perception. The emptiness was a lie, a carefully curated illusion meant to disarm me. I opened the door just enough to peer inside, heart thudding. Everything looked normal, unchanged, yet I could feel the subtle trace of presence, the deliberate orchestration of the past minutes. The apartment smelled colder, drier, the air heavier somehow. I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself of normality, but even my own words sounded suspicious in the stillness. I realized then that the building, the child, and whatever lurked beyond the shadows were all conspiring to make me question not just what I saw, but what I understood about my surroundings. Minutes passed. I thought I might have imagined everything. And then, just as I was about to relax slightly, a faint giggle echoed from down the hall. Light, almost innocuous, but impossibly precise. I froze, my chest tightened, my mind racing. It wasn't random. It was a signal. The child's voice, or a mimic of it, confirming that I had noticed, that I had engaged, that I had begun to play their game. Every instinct I had screamed to leave, but leaving now felt impossible, as though acknowledging their presence had drawn me into something I couldn't escape. The night stretched on. I didn't sleep. Every sound, the distant hum of the heater, the soft creak of a floorboard, even the wind through a cracked window felt imbued with intent. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been shadows, and the child's absence weighed more heavily than its presence had. I understood then that the building had been waiting for me, that the careful placement of the figure, the deliberate silence, and the almost imperceptible signals were all part of a slow, methodical psychological design. I spent the night in my apartment, sitting in one corner, listening. And as dawn finally cracked the darkness, I realized something terrifying. The child, the shadows, the anticipation, they hadn't vanished. They had simply withdrawn, waiting for the next moment, the next Halloween, the next person to notice, and I would never see that building the same way again. Halloween night always had a way of twisting the ordinary into the unsettling, but I never imagined just how fragile that line could be. I had moved into the old apartment building months ago, drawn by cheap rent and a quiet corner of the city. But it quickly became clear that quiet came at a cost. Hallways stretched endlessly into shadow. Vacant units stared back with hollow eyes, and the wind whispered through cracked windows as if sharing secrets I wasn't meant to hear. That night, the streets were empty, save for the faint echo of footsteps that didn't belong to anyone. Then she appeared, a small figure in costume, standing at my door, holding an empty bag with a stillness that made my skin crawl. I asked where her parents were, and she didn't answer. Her eyes, though hidden behind the mask, seemed to pierce me, to measure my hesitation. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, that she wasn't alone, but I couldn't shake the pull to open the door. Shadows lingered, and the air felt impossibly thick, like the building itself was holding its breath. I left that night and never returned. The police couldn't explain what I saw, and the girl never appeared again. Out the memory lingers, a quiet warning behind my eyes. whatever plan they had. It wasn't meant for me to survive unscathed. I only hope sharing this keeps someone else from stepping into that building and following the same path they nearly did. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to the silence that feels wrong, the figures that appear too perfectly, the doors that shouldn't be open. Some nights, curiosity isn't harmless. Some nights, it's bait. Don't let the empty hallways and painted smiles fool you. Leave before the shadows notice you too.